And now you see this is probably like, I don't know, 80, 90% of Africa. And if you look at the color coding, green means BRICS country. So let's, take that off the table. Blue, Ethiopia. Well, that's the Russian military defenses they've already talked about how they're there. Pink is Wagner 1.0. That was pre-go going into Africa. Yellow is 2.0 going into Africa. And if you see this highlighting where it looks a little orange, it's because they're overlapping their operations with the pre-go 1.0 version of the Wagner expedition into Africa. So I also found this really interesting because if you guys remember from religious class number 5, I talked about the obelisks and how there's one obelisk that has been returned out of, the however many that has ever been stolen. The one that was returned was to Ethiopia. I talked about this on that call. Well, this Ethiopian obelisk, I also mentioned on that call, was very significant because it represented the Aksumite kingdom, which they said was extremely extensive, very powerful, and it was basically like a symbol for peace and prosperity in Africa. And how big was their kingdom? It's this orange half-assed trapezoid that you see here. Multiple countries, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Sudan, Somalia, and Yemen. That's how big the kingdom of Aksumite was, where their obelisk was, that they got stolen and now has been returned. And who returned the obelisk? Wagner returned the obelisk. Okay. So let's get into Libya for a quick second. When I was doing some research into Libya, it said that Mad Vlad, meaning Putin, he has another strategic aim for Africa, but specifically for Libya, because it's known as a primary logistical hub and a staging area for Russian military groups. Well, we know from Unicorn Report number 5 through the obelisk and the Portal D class that if there's an area around the world that has been highly contested for not just years, but for decades, and we never really know why there's always so much war, and it never seems to go well. It's just nonstop civil war and infighting, that it's usually tied to some kind of spiritual war. So as soon as I saw this specific, hint from the Hill article, I go, okay, this has to be something tied to religion. So I started looking at Libyan in religious texts, and it popped up Acts 11 and 13. Libya was a big place where Christ had a massive following. So Libya, Syria, Antioch. So, big followers, big disciples of Jesus were there. They talked about a Libyan man. Lucius becomes the leader of the church of Antioch, helping Barnabas and Paul to take the gospel to Asia and Europe, right? So from a religious standpoint, Libya is very, very important, as are some of these other countries in Africa. So then I start looking at more scriptural context. Okay, it says in this article, the Bible talks about the prophecy about how many people in Libya will be engaged in the great evil in the end of days. So that's Armageddon, right? And they start talking about how there could be the Antichrist that potentially comes from that area, potentially Libya, or just from North Africa in general, because these are now the Arabs who live there. And because they occupied all this place and they want to go and they want to take over the Holy Land, so to speak, they want to go fight Israel. So over here it says Daniel 11, we learn that Libya is one of the countries that will be under the control and direction of the Antichrist in the last days. And if you read this little section on the bottom, it talks about, the Bible will tell us the Antichrist will enter the beautiful land that is Israel, and it will stretch out his hand against other countries. So they will fight and they will try to destroy all the other countries. And it says, the Antichrist will gain control of the entire world and force all people who haven't received Christ as the Lord and Savior to bow and worship him or be beheaded. But the Bible specifically notes that the Antichrist will gain control over the hidden treasures of gold and silver, over all the precious things of Egypt, Libya, Ethiopia, the people of Cush. Okay, so now we're starting to see why there are so many wars in this area, because the corrupt Cabal Bible is saying that these people who live in this particular section are going to create the Antichrist, and they're going to go into Israel and attack Israel and try to destroy the Jews. And because of that, we have to go and we have to fight them. So, how do they fight them? Oh, sorry, I skipped one too many. Well, this section of Africa is called the Sahel, and it's basically like geographically speaking, it is a region where the deserts of North Africa meet kind of like the I don't know if you would call it the plains, but kind of like where the grassland of southern Sudan meet. So it's this little band that you see here. And look, that's exactly where all the wars are being fought over the Sahel. By who? They're being fought by a group called the Salafi Jihadi. The Salafi Jihadi is Al Qaeda, guys. That's where all these little black boxes that you see on the bottom of the screen are. So Al Qaeda is fighting for control over the Sahel, and the Sahel region of Africa is where a plethora of all the gold and other precious metals and diamonds and uranium and all that kind of stuff is in Africa. They want to control that part of Africa. And we already know that they took all the obelisks out of, not all, but many of the obelisks out of Egypt, right? So, and then if you look on top of that, this was just in last year, 2023, right? All those narratives about that. But if you look at how Al Qaeda started in Africa, it says as far as 1991, they were fighting in this blue circle and in this blue circle, which is Algeria, Eritrea, Kenya, Libya, Somalia. Right? So literally now we're looking at like 80% of the wars of Africa are being fought because Al Qaeda, who are controlled, as we know, by the cabal, the Zionists and the Kabbalists, right? They're sending them in there to try to take Africa. And we all thought originally that it was over just like the mineral rights or the people, right? Like adrenochrome and how Black people have I still haven't uncovered this, but we do know that Black people have something very special in their blood. And we also know that the children have, better, more pure blood than adults. And that's one of the big reasons why the cabal goes after specifically young Black children or just darker colored skin children. Because of that the melanin in their blood has something to do with a higher potency of adrenochrome and maybe some kind of superpowers, I'm not sure. But if we look at potentially what is that? The Black Panther as a potential guideline for that, we could see how Africa, the kingdom, but also Africa in terms of the people have very special powers, which is why Cabal wants that, right? From not just a physical standpoint, but also from a spiritual aspect of it too. And we also know that, with the obelisks and the pyramids and the ley lines, that's also another big indicator of a lot of spiritual power and portals and let's call it portals to other dimensions and other realms. So when I looked at that, I thought, oh my gosh, well, let's look at ley lines and the positions of a lot of different things. So when I plotted that out, look at some of these massive ley lines, and these are all over some really big parts of Africa and the Middle East, and of course Europe. And look at some of these stargates, portals, obelisks, etc. Right? That's all this area right here. So no wonder they want control over it. And when I was looking at those biblical scriptures, I had not heard of the term Gog and Magog. I know, people who are religious or Christians specifically, Christians and Catholics will have learned of this, but that was a big part of that war that they're talking about, like, the Armageddon, the end of the earth, those kind of prophecies. But then what did I discover during my research? There's a guy who posted this, and I had that source later on in the slideshow, but he wrote, the term Magog comes from Noah's grandson and the forefather of the Europeans. His descendants settled north of the Ararat Mountains, which is known as southern Russia today. So for centuries of human history, they were called the Scythians or the Rus. And then they intermarried with the Slavs and the Tartars from Tartaria to form the Russian people of, modern day Russia. So the leader of Magog is called Gog, right? That's where Gog and Magog term comes from. And Gog is the chief prince, or better known as the Prince of Rosh, which is how they believe came the name Russia. They are saying that Rosh is the ancient name for Russia. So Russia would be Magog, and the leaders of Russia would be, sorry, Russia would be Magog, and the leaders of Russia would be Gog. Okay, so if we go back to that prophecy about how, Israel thinks that the Antichrist is coming from Libya, and not just Libya, but in partnership with all these Arab countries, they're coming to attack Israel to then, try to destroy Israel, the Holy Land with the beautiful people and the beautiful descendants of Christ, etc. That's why they have to go and try to destroy Africa. But what do we know? We know that's the total opposite. We know that Africa is the heartland for Gessera because that's where a lot of the assets are, and a lot of the portals and a lot of the obelisks and pyramids and stuff like that. So I sent that theory over to the developers. I said, is Russia the Magog of the Bible, right? To confirm that article that I read. And that article is from digitalcommons.liberty.edu, by the way. And it says that makes you guys all the GOG, right? The developers, these divine beings that we're working with, who are our stellar developers. And they said, so instead of this being the Antichrist, who's bringing the apocalypse, who are trying to destroy Israel and the country of Israel, and you guys are basically Libya and Sudan and the rest of Africa and all the Arab nations are working with Russia to bring in Gessera and something else that I've redacted. So this must be why Hitler's Afrika Korps #1 and Wagner #2, which is also called Afrika Korps, went in to fight Northern Africa because they need to take control again of not only the assets, but of all the religious spiritual ground to get that back from the cabal that had controlled it through Al-Qaeda in Israel. And Bunny gave me a heart. White Hat Home gave me a heart. I also said Russia's that is the repeat. And then Potato said